Rygar Vengeance is the sequel to Rygar / remake that I made of this classic NES game that has a very special place in my heart, and that's what I want to talk about the most. I don't think that the game gets enough love, okay? I remember when my parents took me all the way to Disneyland, and it was the most fantastic time of my life, and when we came back, they said that I could pick up one Nintendo game, any one that I wanted, on our trip back, because I am Canadian. We went to America to go to Disneyland, and the games were way cheaper back there. So I went to the actual mall, and it was humongous to me because I was just like a little country boy at the time. And I found the Nintendo booth. They had these big Nintendo kiosks in the center of the mall, and they had the play choices on them. That's where you can select what game that you wanted to play for, like, I think 20 seconds. And I was I kept playing the Rygar one. I was a super fan of the arcade. And long story short, instead of picking Zelda, I picked Rygar. Now, Rygar for the NES is actually one of those special titles where Nintendo said that let's give the player a little bit more than the arcade, because the arcade was a very simplistic side scroller. There were some vertical parts, when you were climbing the rope, but that's about it. It was a very simple game. And you got to remember that most of the games were developed in Japan. They were developed for the Japanese market, and everything in Japan for video games was just action adventure, role playing. So it was very cool that they added a lot of those aspects to a game that was essentially just a side scroller. Now remember, Zelda was super popular at the time, the top-down one, not Zelda 2. And so what I think the developers thought of was trying to capitalize on that a little bit. So in order to make it an action-adventure game, they added a top-down view type of level, like the whole world of Argus or Argul or whatever it's called. The point is that they wanted to make it like Zelda in that aspect. And also, it's one of the very first Metroidvania type games. Of course, you've got Metroid on NES. That is the first. But Rygar was the first one that took that actual Symphony of the Night / Metroid thing. It was one of the very first ones that I ever played that was Metroidvania style, because in the arcade you only had to go from left to right and that was it. The screen was over and the stage would end. But in the NES version, you could go up and down. There was different levels. You could backtrack. You could do the top-down view. You could run into areas that you couldn't progress unless you had a specific item. Very Metroidvania. Now, Rygar for NES is still a really, really strong title. I think it's underrated. But one thing I was disappointed about when I was a kid was that they excluded a lot of the arcade things that I thought was unnecessary. They could have kept those in. Maybe they were on a time restriction or hardware limitations, but one of them was in the arcade, when you jumped into certain areas on the stage, you would get these secret kind of Aztec statues that would pop up out of the ground, and they would give you random either points or power-ups. I wanted to put that back into the game. So now when you go through my version, you may see areas that you can get to that don't make much sense. You could say to yourself, well, why would I go over there? And you can think now, well, I might unlock some of those statues to pop up. Give me some power-ups, give me some life, whatever. So it promotes exploration a lot more. Now remember, also in the arcade, it was one hit and you were dead. Very brutal, very vicious. So, of course, when the NES version came out and they wanted to make it action-adventure, you actually had hit points. So every time you got hit, it would take away one of those red, kind of shieldy hit point things that you had on the top of the screen. Well, in the NES version, the original one, if you killed enough enemies, you could actually increase those. It was sort of like an experience point modifier that was in the game. It was called like tone and stuff like that. It was hard to understand. Even as a kid, I couldn't grasp the concept of it. But the more enemies you killed, the more powerful your disc weapon, the more powerful Rygar would become. And he would also get more HP. Well, in my version, what I did was I wanted to make it where you actually had to grab these actual power-up, they look like kind of like shields from the original one, like the coat of arms from the NES version. When you grab those, that actually powers up your HP now, because Rygar himself kind of deals the same amount of damage in my version no matter where he goes. So I kind of took that part out because you can cheese the original NES version, but we'll save that for another time. Another thing the original game didn't have was it didn't have a passcode, and there was no way to save your game. So you had endless continues, but if you had to shut your NES off, you had to start all the way back from the beginning. So I remember his little story for you very quickly. When I was a kid and I was playing the game, I got up early, I got ready for school, I had time before my bus would leave, and I was playing some Rygar, and what I did was I didn't want to start it over, so I left the Nintendo running. I just turned my TV off, went to school, came back home, turned my TV on, and hoped to God your Nintendo didn't glitch out and it would still be running, and that would be the only way that I could actually continue from where I left off. So in my version of the game, I actually put in rooms where you can save your game. Makes sense. They're scattered out amongst all the areas, and they actually have the same statues in it that are from the arcade. I wanted to splash in more arcade type things in the game. Now, it doesn't make the game really any easier because I didn't put a lot of these save rooms around, but at least you can save your game and your whole thing isn't destroyed when you just turn it off. I spent a lot of time on the overall map of this game, like the top-down view mode of the map. For some reason, it just takes a long time to create these, especially in an adventure game. So it gives me even more respect for Nintendo when they actually had to develop Zelda, or anyone else who has to do this same style of game. Now, remember, my game is a sequel / remake, and it's called Vengeance because Rygar, the actual main evil villain in the original that you had to defeat, this time around has kidnapped Rygar's daughter. So it's not really Rygar who's getting revenge here, it's Rygar who's getting revenge. That's why I named it that. And that's the whole basic sole purpose of the game. So you're still in the same world, so I didn't want to completely radically make it different. I still wanted to make it similar, but what I did was I changed the overall top-down view map completely. And of course, all the levels are totally different from the original as well. Some of them still have the same sprites, don't get me wrong, but the way you go through them is completely different. The grappling hook's still in the game, the crossbow's still in the game, the armor's still in the game, and what else? There's one more thing I added. I added bombs to the game that weren't in there before. These are all the items that you have to discover throughout the game in order to progress. Again, Metroidvania style, right? So I thought that was cool. The upgrades also in the game are a little bit different. Like the power-up upgrades are different from the arcade. In the arcade, as opposed to the NES version, you had to pause it. You would grab these stars everywhere, and then you would pause the game and you would select which power-up you wanted. One of them would increase your disc weapon's range, another one made it so you could recover all your HP, good in a pinch, and another one that was really weird to me at the time, it would flash the screen every time you attacked, and you got about 10 of them, and it would hit everything on the screen. So I took all of that out, and what I did was I made it so when you grab the stars in the game, now you have like this godlike maneuver where it just shoots like these Zeus-like lightning bolt energy things out of Rygar, and you can use that anytime you want until you've run out of stars. And I thought it was a great way of kind of capitalizing or kind of just homage to that original just flash screen effect. And another thing I put in was the cross force field that was originally in the arcade and not in the NES version, right? So it just destroys anything that Rygar touches for a limited period of time. Then there's also that little icon with the explosion in it sort of item you can get, and if you touch that, it will just blow up everything on the screen. Again, just a little touch of the arcade splashed in there. There's more enemies I added from the arcade. There's more bosses that I added. I changed the AI and attack patterns on the bosses because some of the original ones in the NES version, they didn't really do much. They sort of just stood there and shoot these weird, I don't know, energy bolts at you. I don't know, and most of them were just reskinned like that. So it was another thing that was a little bit disappointing about the NES version, especially the very end boss. He was completely stationary. He didn't even move at all. No attack pattern whatsoever. pretty disappointing. So now it's all changed. Rygar is a way better end boss. Now he has total freedom of movement everywhere. He attacks with lightning bolts. He's got this crazy lightning sword. He's all over the screen. And then when you defeat him, there's a second form that I don't want to spoil for you. You have to play the game for yourself. So that's it. Rygar Vengeance. I don't think it gets enough love. It's actually the least game that people get from me and actually play, to be honest with you. And I don't know why that is. Tell me why. Do you play Rygar? Are you a fan? Maybe it's just the name of the game itself. People just don't really, they're not really interested in the NES game, so why would they be interested in the sequel? I don't know. Maybe there's some stuff I can add. Maybe there's a big update that I need to add to it. Type it in the comments down below. I get awesome ideas from you guys all the time on the channel that I had before, and I'm hoping to reinvigorate that again. Whatever it is, I don't care. If it's within reason, I can add it to the game to make it better, because the games aren't just for me, they're also for you, right? So if you want to see another great remake of another great NES game, then click up here in the corner. Otherwise, you're just going to make me cry.